The Galactic Survival Academy's final exam had a 93% fatality rate. Not injury rate, mind you. Death rate, which, according to the fine print everyone definitely read before signing up, was considered acceptably educational by the Intergalactic Education Council. Marcus Sullivan, or Mac as he insisted on being called despite every alien in the galaxy butchering the pronunciation, stood in the equipment bay watching his classmates show off their survival gear like it was some kind of high-tech fashion show. And honestly, that comparison wasn't far off the mark. Zephyr, the crystalline perfectionist from Quartz Prime, had laid out her equipment with mathematical precision. Atmospheric processors, molecular food synthesizers, quantum shelter generators. Each device hummed with enough processing power to run a small space station. Her crystalline skin caught the light as she gestured proudly at her collection. "My people have calculated every possible survival scenario," she announced in that tinkling voice that sounded like wind chimes in a hurricane. "These devices account for 4,732 potential environmental hazards." Gorvek, the 7-foot reptilian from the warrior worlds, grunted his approval while hefting what could only be described as a plasma cannon with delusions of being a multi-tool. His scaly hide bore ritual scars that supposedly told the story of his conquests, though Max suspected half of them came from walking into low door frames. "Kretak honor demands superior firepower," Gorvek declared, his forked tongue tasting the air. "When environment attacks, Gorvek attacks back harder." Then there was Pip, the anxious blob-like creature whose species name was literally unpronounceable by anyone with a solid skeletal structure. Pip had brought enough medical supplies to stock a field hospital, their gelatinous form quivering with nervous energy as they arranged and rearranged everything for the 15th time. "But what if someone gets hurt?" Pip worried aloud in their squeaky voice. "What if someone gets really hurt? What if someone gets hurt in a way I haven't prepared for? What if—" "What if you breathe," Mac interrupted, "before you hyperventilate yourself into a puddle?" All eyes turned to Mac as he pulled out his survival kit. The silence that followed was the kind you usually hear right before someone dies in a horror movie, which, given their destination, seemed appropriate. Mac's entire survival kit was contained in an old metal tin that had once held mints. It was dented, scratched, and held together with what appeared to be electrical tape. The label had worn off years ago, leaving behind only the faint ghost of what might have been a logo. The silence stretched longer. "That's it," Zephyr finally managed, her harmonic voice cracking slightly. "That's your entire survival kit." Mac rattled the tin cheerfully. "Yep, everything I need to not die." Gorvek's reptilian features twisted into what might have been confusion or constipation. "Human, that container is smaller than my smallest weapons ammunition cartridge." "And yet," Mac said, tucking the tin into his jacket pocket, "I bet it's more useful than your entire arsenal." Before Gorvek could decide whether to be insulted or just confused, Commander Vex's voice boomed across the equipment bay. The grizzled veteran of a dozen wars and twice as many survival scenarios looked like he'd been carved from granite and disappointment. "Listen up, cadets," Vex announced, his scarred face expressionless. "In 30 minutes, we drop you on Morta 7. Toxic atmosphere, hostile wildlife, extreme weather, and terrain that actively tries to kill you. Your mission is simple. Survive 72 hours until pickup." He paused to let that sink in, his gaze lingering on Mac's pocket. "Some of you have brought enough equipment to terraform a moon. Others," his eyes found Mac's, "have brought what appears to be their lunch container. We'll see which approach keeps you breathing." As they filed toward the transport ship, Mac caught the whispered conversations around him. Bets were being placed on how quickly the human would die. The odds weren't in his favor. Mac just smiled and patted his pocket. Humans had been the galaxy's favorite comedy relief ever since first contact. Too weak, too soft, too paranoid about things that would probably never happen. Well, they were about to find out what all that paranoia was really worth. The transport ship inevitable demise, because apparently the Galactic Navy had a sense of humor darker than a black hole's event horizon, was 30 seconds away from Morta 7 when everything went spectacularly wrong. "Warning," announced the ship's AI in that calm, helpful voice that always preceded catastrophic death. "Multiple system failures detected. Probability of successful landing, 12%. Probability of survival, significantly lower. Have a pleasant day." Mac barely had time to think, "Well, that's not good," before the ship decided to demonstrate what happens when you mix gravity, momentum, and really bad luck. The emergency landing was less controlled descent and more Screaming metal death tube meets immovable planetary surface. They hit the ground with enough force to turn Mac's skeleton into a maraca. Through the chaos of sparks, smoke, and what sounded like Gorvek praying to his warrior gods in a voice 3 octaves higher than usual, Mac heard the beautiful symphony of expensive equipment being reduced to very expensive scrap metal. When the world stopped spinning, and the ringing in his ears died down to a manageable roar, Mac found himself hanging upside down from his safety harness, which was annoying but not nearly as annoying as the fact that half the ship was on fire and the other half was embedded in what looked like purple crystalline rock. "Sound off!" Commander Vex barked, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "Who's still breathing?" "Present," Zephyr chimed, though her usual musical tone sounded more like a broken wind chime. Her precious equipment bay had become an abstract art installation titled, "What Happens When Physics Meets Hubris." "Pretak warriors do not die from simple crashes," Gorvek announced, though Mac noticed he was holding his left arm rather gingerly. His massive plasma cannon was now decorating the far wall in several creative pieces. "I'm okay, I think I'm okay. Wait, am I okay?" Pip babbled, their gelatinous form somehow having absorbed most of the impact. Unfortunately, their medical supplies had been stored in rigid containers, which were now doing their best confetti impression across the crash site. Mac patted his jacket pocket. The little tin was still there, still intact. Of course it was. The thing had probably survived the heat death of several previous universes. "Well," Mac said, unbuckling his harness and dropping to what used to be the ceiling. "This is awkward." Commander Vex was already assessing their situation with the grim efficiency of someone who'd crashed on hostile planets before. "Emergency beacon is fried, main communications arrays scrap, backup powers failing," he gestured toward the buckled hull. "And we're leaking atmosphere into an environment that considers oxygen a delicious snack." Outside, Mortis 7 was doing its best to look welcoming, which is to say it looked like the kind of place where hope goes to die. Purple skies swirled with what might have been clouds or might have been airborne poison. The landscape was a charming mixture of jagged rocks and plants that seemed to be moving when no one was looking directly at them. "How long until pickup?" Pip asked, their voice getting squeakier by the second. Vex checked his chronometer. 71 hours 43 minutes, assuming the pickup crew can find our crash site. Which they can't because our beacon is dead. The silence that followed was the kind that usually precedes panic, despair, or someone suggesting they draw straws to see who gets eaten first. Mac rattled his tin can thoughtfully. "Well, this should be interesting." Mortis 7, as it turned out, had weather patterns designed by someone with a serious grudge against life in general. The purple clouds that had looked merely ominous from inside the ship were now swirling into what could only be described as a toxic hurricane with commitment issues. "Atmospheric analysis indicates incoming storm contains sulfuric acid, metallic particulates, and something the scanner is calling probably shouldn't breathe this," Commander Vex announced, squinting at his damaged tablet. "ETA, 20 minutes. Tip immediately began hyperventilating, which in their case meant expanding and contracting like a very anxious balloon. "We're going to dissolve. We're going to dissolve into goo. Well, I'm already goo, but I'm going to become bad goo." Zephyr's crystalline form was already calculating solutions at light speed. "If we could reconstruct my atmospheric processor from the wreckage, cross-rectionate with the quantum shelter generator fragments, account for the missing power coupling, carry the 7—" "The fragments are melted," Gorvek interrupted, poking at what used to be high-tech survival equipment with his good arm. "Kretak engineering could rebuild weapons from this, but shelter requires finesse." He said the word like it physically hurt him. Mac, meanwhile, had wandered over to a relatively flat section of twisted hull and was examining it with the kind of attention most people reserved for fine art or really good pizza. He popped open his tin, finally, and everyone craned their necks to see what miraculous technology the human had been hiding. Mac pulled out a roll of silver tape. The silence was deafening. "That's duct tape," Zephyr said slowly, her harmonic voice hitting notes usually reserved for funeral dirges. "Indeed it is," Mac agreed cheerfully, unrolling a length and tearing it off with his teeth. "Good old-fashioned fix-anything, holds the universe together duct tape." "That's your secret weapon?" Gorvik demanded. "Adhesive strips?" Mac reached back into the tin and produced a folded sheet of clear plastic, a handful of safety pins, and what appeared to be a small spool of fishing line. "Oh, this is just the opening act." While his classmates watched in fascinated horror, Mac began working with the kind of methodical efficiency that suggested he'd done this before, many times, probably in his backyard just in case. He used the duct tape to seal the hull breaches, creating an airtight pocket in the wreckage. The plastic sheeting went up next, stretched and pinned to form a double-wall barrier. The fishing line became a support structure, tension between twisted metal beams with knots that would make a sailor weep with joy. "This is insane," Zephyr muttered, but Mac noticed she was taking notes on her damaged tablet. "You're building a shelter from garbage and primitive adhesives." "Hey now," Mac said, carefully sealing another joint. "This isn't garbage. This is time-tested, grandpa-approved, works when everything else fails technology. Humans have been using variations of this setup since we figured out that outside was trying to kill us." The first drops of acid rain began hitting the ground outside, sizzling where they landed. Pip whimpered and oozed closer to Mac's improvised shelter. "But how did you know what to bring?" Pip asked. "How did you calculate the exact materials needed for this specific scenario?" Mac paused in his work and grinned. "I didn't. I just brought stuff that fixes most problems. Duct tape sticks things together. Plastic keeps things out. String ties things up. Safety pins hold things in place. You can solve about 90% of life's problems with those 4 things." "What about the other 10%? Gorvek asked, genuinely curious now. "More duct tape." The storm hit like an angry god with a chemistry set. Outside their little bubble of recycled hull and human ingenuity, the world turned into a hellscape of dissolving rock and screaming wind. Inside, 5 beings sat in relative comfort, while Mac's patchwork shelter held against everything Morta 7 could throw at it. "I don't understand," Zephyr said, her crystalline form flickering in the dim light. "My people spent centuries developing survival technology. We ran millions of simulations, calculated every possible variable." Mac was checking the seal on one corner, making minor adjustments. "That's your problem right there. You plan for every possibility you could think of. But the universe is creative. It's got problems you've never even imagined yet." He gestured at their surroundings. "This storm? I bet it wasn't in your 4,000 scenarios. So all your fancy equipment was designed for the wrong disaster. And your solution was to bring primitive tools?" "My solution was to bring tools that work on problems I haven't met yet." Mac settled back against the hull, looking insufferably satisfied. "Sometimes the best technology is the kind that doesn't try to be too clever." Outside, the storm raged for 3 hours. Inside, everyone was warm, dry, and developing a grudging respect for the humans' ridiculous little tin can. When the toxic winds finally died down and Mac began dismantling their temporary shelter, Gorvik shook his massive head in amazement. "Human paranoia," he muttered. "Who carries duct tape to Space Academy?" Mac just winked. "Someone who plans to graduate." Day 2 on Morta 7 began with what Commander Vex diplomatically called additional complications, and what any reasonable person would call everything going straight to hell in a handbasket. The acid storm had done more than just test Mac's shelter-building skills. It had also contaminated their emergency water supplies and turned their food rations into something that resembled abstract art, created by a very disturbed chemist. The purple goo that had once been concentrated protein bars was still bubbling ominously in the corner. "Water analysis complete," Vex announced, holding up his scanner with the expression of someone delivering terminal news. "Heavy metals, organic toxins, and something the database is calling nope, just nope. One sip of this stuff and you'll be hallucinating your way into the afterlife." Pip was already in full panic mode, their gelatinous form cycling through colors like a very stressed mood ring. "We're going to starve. We're going to die of thirst. We're going to starve while dying of thirst. Or maybe die of thirst while starving. Is there a word for dying of both at the same time?" "Yes," said Gervik grimly. "Dead." Zephyr was frantically trying to calculate survival scenarios on her damaged tablet, her crystalline form flickering with stress patterns. "Without proper hydration and nutrition, we have approximately 18 hours before cognitive function begins to deteriorate, 36 hours before physical collapse, 48 hours before we become very attractive corpses," Mac finished cheerfully, apparently immune to the growing despair around him. "Yeah, I get it. Good thing we're not going to let that happen." He opened his trusty tin can again, and this time everyone crowded around like he was about to perform magic, which, considering their circumstances, wasn't far from the truth. Mac pulled out what looked like a handful of small white tablets. "Water purification tablets. Drop a couple of these bad boys in contaminated water, wait 20 minutes, and you've got something that won't immediately kill you." "That's impossible," Zephyr protested. "The contamination levels are beyond anything simple chemical purification could handle." "Says the person whose molecular processor is currently decorating the landscape in very expensive pieces," Mac replied, dropping 2 tablets into a container of the toxic water. "Sometimes simple is better than impossible." While they waited for the tablets to work their magic, Mac dove back into his tin and produced what appeared to be a tangle of nearly invisible line with tiny hooks attached, fishing line and hooks to be precise. "Please tell me you're not planning to fish in that purple nightmare out there," Vex said, pointing toward the acidic lake that had formed during the storm. "Not that lake, no. That lake would dissolve me faster than Pip dissolves his problems." Mac grinned and pointed to a smaller pool that had formed in a rocky depression about 50 meters away. "That one. Fresh rainwater filtered through rock, probably full of local fish things that are just begging to become dinner." Gorvek snorted. "And what makes you think there are edible creatures in there?" Mac was already heading toward the pool, unwinding his fishing line. "Because life finds a way. And if life found a way here, then something's eating something else, which means there's a food chain, and food chains end in dinner." The pool did indeed contain life. Small, silvery creatures that looked like fish crossed with disco balls were darting through the clear water, their scales catching what little light filtered through the purple sky. "Now comes the real human secret," Mac announced, pulling out what appeared to be a small metal container and a piece of black stone. Fire. He had started gathering dried plant matter, carefully selecting pieces that didn't look like they'd try to eat him back, while explaining his process like he was hosting the galaxy's most dangerous cooking show. "See, every species in the galaxy has mastered energy manipulation. Plasma this, quantum that, molecular whatever. But sometimes you just need to make things hot, the old-fashioned way." He struck the flint against steel, producing a shower of sparks that caught in the tinder he'd prepared. Within minutes he had a proper fire going, built in a ring of stones to contain it and positioned to avoid the worst of the wind. "Fire," he continued, threading a hook with what looked like a piece of their ruined equipment. "Kills bacteria, breaks down toxins, makes tough things soft, and turns raw fish things into cooked fish things. Plus, it keeps the monsters away." "Who are monsters?" Pip squeaked, immediately looking around for threats. "All of them. Nothing with half a brain wants to mess with the species that figured out how to tame elemental forces for fun and profit." The first fish took the bait within 10 minutes. Mac pulled it up with the kind of smooth efficiency that spoke of countless hours spent fishing in places where failure meant going hungry. The creature was about the size of his hand, definitely fish-like, and definitely not trying to kill anyone. "Edibility test," Mac announced, cutting off a small piece and examining it carefully. "Look for unusual colors, weird smells, anything that screams, 'I'm poisonous and proud of it.'" The flesh was pale, smelled faintly of vanilla, and showed no obvious warning signs. He cooked the test piece thoroughly and took a small bite. Rule 1 of survival. If you don't know what something is, try a little bit and wait. If you're not dead in 30 minutes, try a little more. While they waited to see if Mac would keel over, he caught 3 more fish and started preparing a proper meal. The water purification tablets had done their job, transforming the toxic soup into something that looked and smelled like actual water. "This is insane," Zephyr muttered, but Mac noticed she was taking detailed notes again. "You're gambling with your life based on primitive trial and error." "I'm gambling with my life based on millions of years of human evolution and a few thousand years of hard-won experience," Mac corrected, filleting the fish with a small knife that had also emerged from his miracle tin. "My ancestors figured out what was safe to eat by watching what didn't kill the guy who tried it first. Then they passed that knowledge down through generations of people who really, really didn't want to die from dinner." The 30 minutes passed without Max showing any signs of toxic poisoning, so he began cooking the rest of their catch. The smell of properly prepared fish things filled the air, and everyone's stomachs began making sounds that could probably be heard from orbit. "But how did you know to bring fishing equipment?" Pip asked, their anxiety temporarily overridden by curiosity and hunger. "How did you calculate that this specific planet would have fishable water sources?" Mac turned the fish carefully, making sure they cooked evenly. "I didn't. I just know that most planets with life have water. Most water has things living in it, and most living things can be convinced to become food with the right approach. Fishing line and hooks work pretty much everywhere." He pulled out a small container of what looked like salt. "Seasoning, because if you're going to eat mystery fish on a death planet, you might as well make it taste good." The meal was, by all accounts, surprisingly decent. The fish had a delicate flavor that the salt enhanced nicely, and the purified water tasted better than anything they'd had since leaving the academy. More importantly, everyone was alive, fed, and hydrated. "I don't understand your species," Gorvik admitted, gnawing on a fishbone. "You prepare for dangers that may never come, using tools that shouldn't work, based on knowledge that seems random." Mac was already cleaning his fishing gear and banking the fire for later use. "That's because you're thinking about it wrong. We don't prepare for specific dangers. We prepare for the concept of danger. Any danger. All danger." He gestured at their surroundings with a fishbone. "You brought equipment designed to handle the problems you could imagine. We bring tools designed to handle the problems we can't." "Human paranoia," Zephyr said, but this time it sounded almost respectful. Mac grinned and patted his tin can. "The best kind of paranoia, the kind that keeps you breathing." As the artificial day cycle began to dim, everyone felt considerably better about their chances. They had shelter, food, water, and a growing appreciation for the contents of one beat-up metal tin. They also had no idea that Mortis 7's nocturnal predators were about to wake up. The first sign that their day was about to get significantly worse came at what passed for sunset on Mortis 7. The purple sky had darkened to a shade that could best be described as impending doom violet when the howling started. It wasn't the kind of howling you hear from normal, well-adjusted predators who just want to eat you and get on with their lives. This was the kind of howling that suggested the local wildlife had attended advanced courses in psychological warfare and graduated with honors in making sentient beings wet themselves. "That's not good," Commander Vex muttered, checking his sidearm and discovering what everyone already knew. It was as dead as their chances of having a peaceful night. The howling was joined by a chorus of sounds that ranged from unsettling chittering to the screams of mechanical demons to what happens when you play death metal backwards through a meat grinder. And it was getting closer. "Movement on thermal," Vex announced, squinting at his barely functional scanner. "Multiple heat signatures. Large, fast, and very, very interested in our location." Pip had gone completely transparent with terror, which was apparently a thing their species did when faced with imminent death. "We're going to be eaten. We're going to be eaten by things that probably don't even have the courtesy to kill us first." Gorvek was hefting a twisted piece of metal from the wreckage, his warrior instincts kicking in despite the lack of proper weapons. "Kreetok will die with honor, but Kreetok would prefer to kill enemies first." Zephyr's crystalline form was flickering through rapid calculations. "Without weapons or defensive systems, our probability of survival against unknown predators is approximately 0.00. "Yeah, we get it," Mac interrupted, but instead of panic, his voice carried the kind of calm focus that suggested he was already 3 steps ahead of the problem. "Matt's not our friend right now. Good thing Matt's never been humanity's strong suit anyway." He opened his tin can, which by now everyone regarded as either a miracle device or evidence that humans were touched by cosmic forces beyond comprehension, and began pulling out items with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd thought about this exact scenario way too many times. First came a small bottle of clear liquid. Rubbing alcohol, antiseptic, fire starter, and, when properly applied, temporary courage enhancement. He tucked it into his belt. Next, a coil of thin wire that gleamed in the firelight. Snare wire. Incredibly strong, nearly invisible, and really, really good at making things trip over their own feet, or claws, or tentacles, whatever passes for locomotive appendages around here. A handful of small, cylindrical objects followed. Firecrackers. Because sometimes you need to make noise, bright lights, or small explosions. Preferably all 3 at once. "You carry explosives to survival school?" Vex demanded, though his tone suggested professional interest rather than disapproval. "I carry tools," Mac replied, pulling out what looked like a small mirror, a magnifying glass, and several metal objects of indeterminate purpose. "The fact that some of those tools can explode is just a happy coincidence." The howling was definitely getting closer now, and through the growing darkness they could see shapes moving just beyond the firelight. Large shapes, shapes with too many legs, and not enough regard for the natural order of things. "Right," Mac announced, standing up with the kind of confidence that was either inspiring or completely delusional. "Here's how this is going to work. Everyone's got a job, everyone follows instructions exactly, and everyone lives to tell embarrassing stories about this later." He began laying out his plan with the rapid-fire efficiency of someone who'd clearly thought about fighting unknown monsters in hostile environments more than any reasonable person should. "Gorvek, you're our heavy hitter. Take these." He handed over what appeared to be modified pieces of shipwreckage, "and position yourself at the narrow gap between those 2 rock formations. Anything that comes through there gets the full Kreetok warrior experience." The reptilian warrior examined the improvised weapons and nodded approvingly. These will break bones. Mac understands proper weapon balance. Zephyr, you're our early warning system. That crystalline structure of yours picks up vibrations, right? Position yourself where you can feel them coming and give us direction and distance. Call it out, loud and clear. The crystalline being's form shifted into what might have been surprise. You want me to use my natural resonance frequencies as a detection grid? That's actually quite clever. Pip, you're our medic and our panic coordinator. Stay in the center, keep track of everyone, and if someone gets hurt, you're our lifeline. Also, that transparency thing you do? That's not fear. That's camouflage. Use it. Pip's gelatinous form solidified slightly with purpose. I can do that. I can definitely do that. Probably. Maybe. Yes, I can do that. Mac turned to Commander Vex. And you, sir, get to help me turn this crash site into the galaxy's most unfriendly bed and breakfast. Working quickly, Mac began stringing his wire between broken pieces of the ship, creating invisible trip lines at ankle height. He positioned the firecrackers at strategic points, rigged to go off when the wires were disturbed. The mirror and magnifying glass were arranged to catch and redirect the firelight, creating confusing bright spots that would dazzle night-adapted eyes. The idea, Mac explained while working, is not to fight them head-on. The idea is to make them fight the environment, fight each other, and fight their own assumptions about what they're dealing with. The first predator emerged from the darkness like something from a fever dream designed by a committee of particularly disturbed artists. It stood roughly 8 feet tall, on 6 legs that ended in claws designed for tearing apart anything foolish enough to be made of matter. Its head was mostly teeth, with eyes that reflected the firelight like malevolent stars. "Contact," Zephyr called out, her crystalline form resonating with incoming vibrations. 3 large signatures approaching from the northwest, 2 more from the east, something really big moving up from the south. "Showtime," Mac muttered, lighting a piece of cloth soaked in alcohol and tossing it toward one of the firecracker positions. The first predator hit Mac's wire trap at full charge. The nearly invisible snare caught its front legs, sending it tumbling into a spectacular crash that would have been hilarious if not for the death and dismemberment implications. The impact triggered 2 firecrackers simultaneously, filling the air with bright flashes and sharp bangs that sent the creature into a confused rage. "It's working," Pip called out from their central position. "It's confused and angry." "Angry is good," Mac replied, adjusting his mirror to send a beam of concentrated light directly into another approaching predator's eyes. "Confused and angry means stupid. Stupid means predictable." The second and third creatures approached more cautiously, but Mac's light tricks and noisemakers kept them disoriented and suspicious of every shadow. When one finally made it through the defensive perimeter, it ran directly into Gorvek's position. The Kretak warrior's battle cry could probably have been heard from the next star system. His improvised weapons, pieces of ship hull that Mac had helped him balance and sharpen, met the predator in a clash that sent sparks flying. Literally, because the creature's claws struck the metal with enough force to generate actual sparks. "Multiple contacts," Zephyr called out, her voice tight with concentration. "The noise is attracting more. Count at least 8 signatures now, various sizes." Mac was already moving to his next defensive position, a bottle of alcohol in one hand and a lit piece of cloth in the other. "Time for the dramatic finale," he announced, just before turning their entire crash site into a scene from the galaxy's most dangerous fireworks display. The alcohol ignited in spectacular fashion, creating barriers of flame that forced the predators to approach from predictable angles. The remaining firecrackers went off in sequence, creating a light show that would have been impressive at a festival and was absolutely terrifying in a life-or-death situation. But the real genius of Mac's defense wasn't the individual elements, it was how they worked together. The lights confused the predator's night vision. The sounds masked the defenders' movements while amplifying their own noise. The fire created barriers that channeled the attacks into prepared positions. And the whole chaotic mess made the crash site look like it was defended by a much larger, much more dangerous group than 5 Academy cadets and 1 instructor. The largest predator, the one Zephyr had detected approaching from the south, finally made its appearance. It was roughly the size of a small shuttle, covered in natural armor that looked like it could deflect plasma bolts, and equipped with enough teeth to stock a moderately sized dental clinic. "That's a big one," Vex observed with professional calm. "That's a really big one," Gorvek added, but his warrior training kept him in position. "That's way too big," Pip whimpered, going fully transparent again. Mac looked at the approaching monster, looked at his nearly empty tin can, and grinned. "Ha ha ha, that's perfect." He pulled out his last surprise, a small device that looked like it had been cobbled together from electronic components and held together with hope and determination. "Emergency beacon," he announced. "Been saving this for the right moment." "That's not standard issue," Vex protested. "No, it's not. I built it from spare parts because I figured there might come a time when I needed to call for help and all the official equipment was broken." Mac activated the device, and a bright signal light began pulsing in a complex pattern. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Universal distress signal. The massive predator paused, its primitive brain trying to process the strange light pattern. That moment of confusion was all Mac needed. "Now comes the really crazy part," he announced, picking up a burning branch from their fire and walking directly toward the creature. "Mac, what are you doing?" Zephyr called out, her crystalline form flickering with alarm. "Something my grandfather taught me," Mac replied, holding the flame high and making himself as large and loud as possible. "Sometimes the best defense is a good crazy." He began shouting at the top of his lungs. Not words, just noise. Loud, angry, completely unhinged human noise while waving fire around like he was conducting the galaxy's most dangerous orchestra. The combination of unpredictable behavior, bright flames, and sheer human audacity apparently convinced the massive predator that it had encountered something too insane to be worth the trouble. The creature backed away, then turned and lumbered off into the darkness, taking most of the smaller predators with it. In the sudden quiet that followed, everyone stared at Mac as he calmly extinguished his torch and dusted off his hands. "And that," he said with satisfaction, "is why humans don't have natural armor, venom, claws, or superhuman strength. We have something better." "What's that?" Pip asked, slowly returning to their normal opacity. Mac patted his tin can one more time. "We're too weird to eat safely. Most predators take one look at human behavior and decide we're probably poisonous." The beacon continued pulsing its distress signal into the night sky, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of approaching rescue ships began to echo across Mortis 7's hostile landscape. The rescue team from the Galactic Academy found them 3 hours later, following Mac's improvised beacon signal through the purple dawn of Mortis 7's artificial sunrise. What they discovered was 5 Academy cadets and 1 instructor, sitting around a carefully maintained fire, sharing breakfast fish and what appeared to be the galaxy's most relaxed survival story. Captain Voss, the rescue team leader, stepped out of the pristine rescue shuttle with the kind of expression reserved for discovering that reports of certain death had been greatly exaggerated. His spotless uniform and by-the-book demeanor stood in stark contrast to the group of survivors, who looked like they'd been having a camping trip on the surface of hell. "Status report," Voss demanded, his scanner already analyzing the crash site for casualties, structural damage, and the inevitable paperwork that came with Academy training disasters. "All present and accounted for, sir," Commander Vex replied, though his tone carried a note of barely suppressed amusement. "0 casualties, 0 serious injuries, and 1 very educational 72 hours. Captain Voss's scanner beeped as it analyzed the defensive arrangements around the crash site. "Explain the improvised fortifications, the evidence of controlled fires, and why our thermal imaging is picking up the scattered remains of what appears to be several large predators in the surrounding area." Before Vex could answer, Gorvek stood up and executed what was probably the most respectful salute of his military career. "Sir, request permission to recommend Cadet Sullivan for Advanced Survival Instructor certification." The captain's eyebrows rose approximately half an inch, which for someone of his rigid demeanor was equivalent to dropping his jaw in shock. "Cadet Sullivan, the human with the disciplinary record for excessive preparation for unlikely scenarios?" "The very same," Zephyr chimed in, her crystalline form catching the morning light as she held up her tablet. "Captain, I've documented 17 distinct survival techniques that don't appear in any Academy manual. Techniques that proved more effective than standard equipment in real-world application." Pip, who had returned to their normal opacity and slightly less panicked baseline anxiety level, bounced forward enthusiastically. "He saved us all with a tin can! A tiny, beat-up, impossible tin can that had everything we needed and more." Captain Voss turned his attention to Mac, who was sitting cross-legged by the fire, using a pointed stick to toast what appeared to be more of the local fish, equivalent for his breakfast. The human looked up with the kind of satisfied expression that suggested he'd just won a bet with the universe itself. The inclusion container of the captain said slowly, "Your official survival kit consisted of 1 small metal container and its contents. According to the pre-mission inventory, this container was listed as non-standard equipment and logged under personal effects of dubious utility. Mac swallowed a bite of fish and grinned. Yes, sir, that sounds about right. Yet you managed to provide shelter, potable water, food procurement, fire management, and defensive capabilities sufficient to repel multiple predator attacks using only items from this container. Well, I had help, Mac said, gesturing toward his classmates. Turns out, when you give people the right tools, they're pretty good at not dying. Captain Voss was now examining Mac's tin can with the kind of reverence usually reserved for holy relics or extremely dangerous weapons. Cadet, I need you to provide a complete inventory of this container's contents. Mac rattled the tin, which still had a few items left inside. Let's see. Still got some aspirin, a needle and thread, a small knife, waterproof matches as backup to the flint, a whistle, some water purification tablets, a length of paracord, a tiny compass, a signal mirror, some safety pins, electrical tape, superglue, a pencil, some paper, a few more firecrackers, and... He reached in and pulled out a small, wrapped object. Emergency chocolate, because sometimes morale is more important than calories. The silence that followed was the kind that occurs when professional military minds encounter something that fundamentally challenges their understanding of how the universe works. Cadet Sullivan, Captain Voss said finally, how did you determine what items to include in your survival kit? Mac unwrapped the chocolate and broke off a piece, offering it to his teammates before taking a bite himself. I didn't determine anything, sir. I just asked myself one question. If everything went wrong, what would I want to have with me? That's not a proper methodology, the captain protested. There are protocols for equipment selection, probability matrices for scenario planning, computer models for optimal resource allocation. And how'd those work out for everyone else's gear? Mac asked, gesturing toward the scattered remains of high-tech equipment around the crash site. All that fancy stuff was designed for specific problems, but problems don't read the manual. He stood up and dusted off his hands, looking around at their improvised camp with obvious pride. So instead of trying to predict what would go wrong, I packed stuff that helps when things go wrong. Any things. All things. Commander Vex stepped forward, and Mac was surprised to see something that looked almost like pride in the grizzled veteran's expression. Captain, in 30 years of survival training, I've never seen a cadet adapt to unexpected circumstances with this level of effectiveness. Sullivan's approach represents a fundamental shift in survival methodology. Explained. Traditional survival training focuses on equipment optimization for known threats. Sullivan's approach focuses on problem-solving optimization for unknown threats. He doesn't prepare for specific disasters. He prepares for the concept of disaster itself. Captain Voss was taking notes now, his military mind clearly working through the implications. And this approach proved more effective than our standard protocols? Sir, Gorvak interjected, his warrior's pride evident in his voice. Standard protocols had us dead within the first day. Sullivan's methods had us eating well and sleeping comfortably while fending off predators that our equipment couldn't even detect properly. Zephyr added her crystalline voice to the testimonials. Captain, I ran continuous probability analyses throughout our survival period. By every metric I could calculate, we should have failed catastrophically. Sullivan's techniques achieved impossible results because they weren't constrained by what should be possible. The rescue captain looked around the camp one more time, taking in the evidence of their 72-hour survival adventure. The sealed shelter that had withstood acid storms. The water purification setup that had turned poison into sustenance. The fire pit that had provided warmth, cooking, and defense. The defensive positions that had turned a crash site into a fortress. All of it created using the contents of a dented metal tin that could fit in someone's pocket. Cadet Sullivan, Captain Voss said finally, "You're going to be late for your next class." Mac blinked. Sir? Advanced survival instruction. You're being transferred immediately to instructor track. Seems the academy has some catching up to do on survival methodology. The captain paused, then added, And cadet? Yes, sir. Bring the tin can. I have a feeling we're going to want to study its contents very carefully. As the rescue shuttle prepared for departure, Mac took one last look at Mortis 7's hostile landscape. The purple sky, the acid-scarred rocks, the distant sounds of predators that had learned to give humans a very wide berth. You know what the funny thing is? He said to his teammates as they boarded the shuttle. What's that? Pip asked. Mac patted his jacket pocket, where his tin can rested safe and sound. I packed all this stuff because I was worried about getting stranded on a hostile planet with broken equipment and no way to call for help. Gorvek's reptilian features twisted into what might have been a smile. Human paranoia strikes again. The best kind, Mac agreed. The kind that turns disasters into educational opportunities. As the shuttle lifted off from Mortis 7, Mac was already thinking about what he might add to his tin can for the next impossible situation. Because if there was one thing humans understood better than any other species in the galaxy, it was that somewhere out there, the universe was cooking up problems they hadn't even imagined yet. And when those problems arrived, Mac intended to be ready for them. After all, someone had to be the galaxy's designated what-if specialist. Might as well be the species that was paranoid enough to pack chocolate for the apocalypse. The rescue shuttle disappeared into the purple sky, leaving Mortis 7 to its toxic storms and confused predators, who would spend the next several generations telling increasingly embellished stories about the strange visitors who had turned their hunting ground into the galaxy's most educational disaster area. And somewhere in the Academy archives, a dented metal tin can was about to become the most studied piece of survival equipment in galactic history.